Okay, my name is Issa Spatrisano. I am the Program Director and the State Refugee Coordinator of our Catholic Social Services Refugee Assistance and Immigration Services Program. I'm really grateful that you joined us tonight so we can talk a little bit more about refugee resettlement. This is actually my dream come true, having studied history and political science in my undergraduate degree. I never get to use those skills on a day-to-day basis in this job. I mean, I do in lots of ways, but not so much to walk you through the historical analysis of how we got here. This is like a dream come true for me. So when I got the opportunity to do something more in depth about refugee resettlement, this was the topic I was really excited to talk about. The purpose of this really is for us to share some information, but it's also to have a conversation. So we'll leave lots of time at the end for question and answers, and those questions could go on a variety of different things. I'd be happy to answer questions related to refugee resettlement. And then we're also lucky because Lisa Aquino, who's the CEO of Catholic Social Services, is here, and she'll be presenting with me. So I'll turn it over to Lisa for a few words before we kind of jump in.
Great. Thank you so much, Issa. And I'm really excited to be here too. The other two Zoom presentations like this have just been wonderful. I saw the first one, I was part of it, and the second one I wasn't able to be, but I've heard nothing but amazing things. So I'm here, and I think a lot of people on this call know this, but just to set the stage, I'm the CEO at Catholic Social Services, and at Catholic Social Services we have a broad mission to serve the vulnerable, to strengthen families and individuals, and to advocate for social justice. And with that mission, we're providing a number of vital programs to serve people in the community. We're one of the largest and most well-established social service agencies in Anchorage. We've been doing this work for over 50 years. So we have the largest food pantry in the state. We're the largest provider of homeless services in the city. We also have programs specializing in serving children who are legally separated from their families and languishing in OCS, and serving individuals who experience a developmental disability. Today, I'm so proud to be here to talk about our Refugee Assistance and Immigration Services program with the amazing Issa. And today, Issa will talk about the history of the Refugee Resettlement Program in the US and a little bit about the history of our program. And then I'll briefly end our presentation to tell you a little bit about why refugee resettlement is such an important part of the work we do at CSS, and why we're committed to these critical services. But I just want to say that so much of what we're going to be talking about today is a little higher level, right? It's about programs and systems. I just want to please remind all of us that every refugee on this planet is a person, and each of these people has a story. And we at CSS are honored to know some of those stories. Some of those stories live in our CSS team. We have staff who are refugees, and some of those stories are our clients and our friends in the community. And these stories make our whole community richer and better. And talking today about our program, what we do, why it exists, how we are connected to it, is a chance to understand the background against which some of these stories play out. So we're really proud to be a part of this global initiative and commitment to supporting and working with refugees and welcoming them to this community. And I'll pass it to Issa for the presentation.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm going to share my screen. I don't want to get too slide heavy, but I think what we're going to talk about is a little bit challenging. So I'm going to share my screen, so I hope you can see it. All right, I'll get a nod from Lisa that you can see the first part of the slides. Cool. All right, so I just want to talk about, really, when I got the opportunity to choose what I was going to talk about in my 1 hour Zoom conversation, I really wanted to talk about how we got here. And I'll tell you why I want to talk about how we got here. I have been the director of RAIS for the last 2 years, but before that, I've been working in refugee resettlement since 2012. 6 of those years here at CSS, and then 1 year in Kansas City, Missouri. And when I started my work in refugee resettlement in 2012, a lot of the conversations we're having today were not conversations we were having in 2012. And I think I wanted to go back and talk about, like, how did this happen? Why is there a refugee resettlement program? Because it didn't come out of nowhere. And Lisa's talking about humans and people in need, and that's where this started, and that's where it came from. And that's where we still are today. And so for me to have an opportunity to talk about that, I think that really truly tells the story of resettlement and why it exists and why we still do the work we do today. And so you know, how did we get here? World War II. I mean, that's really a catalyst that started part of this. And, you know, during World War II, it was the largest number of displaced people on record. And I want to tell you that I wish that that was still the historical narrative of today, but it's not. Because today, we have surpassed the numbers of displaced people on record during World War II. We are in the largest crisis in modern global history, really, for refugees and internally displaced persons. So the start of the story about refugee resettlement really starts with World War II, and the narrative of today is linked to that too, with the largest number of people currently displaced on record. So what happened? World War II happened. And as you all are aware, there were a lot of things going on during World War II, not just like global displacement from the fighting and other things, but the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity that were occurring. And so the United States, following World War II, passed what was called the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. And this act really allowed more than 350,000 people to enter the US, 80,000 which were displaced Jewish people. And as part of that act, it required them to find a place to live and a job. And it kind of was that very first step in like a legal system related to refugees. And this act actually expired in 1952. And so we're kind of going to walk through how we got there. But this picture is what was called the Ship to Freedom. This is the very first boat that came over from Europe. It brought 813 Europeans, displaced people. There were 11 nations represented on the ship. They arrived to the United States right after this act was passed under the new quota. And they were the very first displaced people allowed to enter under this. And so they left Europe with that giant sign, Ship to Freedom. At that very first, like this is really the first resettlement we see. And so while that's happening in the US, there's this global conversation happening at the United Nations. And so the establishment of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees happened in 1950. And then really in 1951, there was a convention that really went down to like, what does it mean to be a refugee? And if you have listened to me speak or you've worked with RAIS before, or you know anything about refugee resettlement, you've definitely heard this definition from me. This is the definition we follow today about who qualifies as a refugee. And so a refugee is someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So for me, whenever I talk about this, two really important sides: well-founded fear of persecution, and they must have left the borders of their own country. We can't be within the borders of our own country and still qualify as a refugee. What's interesting in 1951 when this happened is the US didn't sign this initial agreement. They didn't sign on to that definition of a refugee. But there's still a lot at play. The globe is going through a number of different things. In the US, on the legal side, on the legislative side, is trying to figure out how to welcome people through a patchwork really system of resettlement is what I like to call it. There's a lot more than this. This is just a very high overview. So if you're really interested in this, send me an email. There's really good links on USCIS that lay this out in a very nice timeline. But you know, there's the Refugee Relief Act of 1953. This allows almost 200,000 special immigrant visas for refugees and escapees coming from communist countries. That's one thing. And then in 1960, they passed the Fair Share Refugee Act. This allowed about 5,000 refugees to enter the US. And an important part in this, it allowed them to become lawful permanent residents after 2 years. That's an important thing. That's that first step towards permanency, right? The ability to stay long-term and become a US citizen and move towards that. Then we have a Cuban refugee crisis. More than 58,000 Cubans are allowed to enter the US under that program that was passed in the 60s. And then finally, the Migration and Refugee Assistance Act of 1962. This act was the first time that Congress was really providing monetary assistance to refugees, recognizing that when someone comes here, they may need initial assistance. And really it was focused on people that were fleeing Cold War communist countries and entering the US. And up to 20,000 people could enter the US under that act. So we kind of see a change. First, it's just people that are displaced out of World War II can come. Then it's, okay, here's a specialty act for communist countries. Then it's a specialty act for Cubans. Then it's 5,000. Then it's up to 20,000. We're really just creating a consistent welcome, but in special categories, and not with a broad, overarching, formalized program. And then we really start to build towards this need of a resettlement program, and something important happens in 1967. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees meet again, and they actually remove some geographical and temporal limits that were written into the original 1951 definition that were really quite specific to World War II. And they kind of removed those and said, no, a refugee is a refugee who's a refugee, right? It doesn't matter necessarily the region or the time frame of what caused them to have to flee. You know, if they have a reasonable fear of persecution, they have a reasonable fear of persecution. That was signed by the United States. And that's important for us to really start to create a legal legislative pathway towards a program. And then the Indo-Chinese Immigration and Refugee Act of 1975 happened. And if you worked in resettlement a long time, or you've been familiar with resettlement a long time, we often hear about Hmong refugees, when Hmong refugees arrive. And this is really the start of that. The conflict in Vietnam ended, and when the conflict in Vietnam ended, a number of individuals in that community or in those countries had supported or served in the US military. And ultimately, almost 300,000 Southeast Asians entered the US between 1975 and 1980. Now, their transportation and resettlement was funded, and they were eligible to become lawful permanent residents. But also with 5 years and 300,000 people arriving, it became very clear that there needed to be a program, that there needed to be some structure, some supports, some ways to like do this work in a more effective way for both sides, really, for clients to be successful, for arrivals to be successful, and also for individuals on the receiving end. And I think in some ways that 300,000 arrival really prompted this discussion to be had in a broader way. And we named this 40 years of refugee resettlement because what happened was, and the slide's not changing. Let me try that again. Because really what happened is that the 1980 Refugee Act passed. And when the 1980 Refugee Act passed, this created the current resettlement structure that we still operate in today. So this really is 40 years of refugee resettlement, if we're not counting the many years of resettlement in programs that operated even before this. And so what I'm really trying to get at in this is like, this isn't new. This isn't the welcome to the United States to people fleeing persecution or fleeing political strife. It's not new. We've been doing this for a very long time in a number of different ways. And if we're celebrating only the most recent Refugee Act of 1980, we're still celebrating 40 years of very long history. And the Refugee Resettlement Act did a couple of really important things. It created a uniform and comprehensive way for refugee admissions to come into the country. It provided the first basis for asylum, which is now really important, especially as we talk about this year, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which was established through this act, will serve more asylees than they will refugees in the United States. And so really asylees and people fleeing persecution and other ways that may be entering the country, that was an important part of this act. And it also increased the number of refugees who could be admitted annually. And so this was important too, because we saw 5,000 in this category, 20,000 here. It's these pockets, but really what this did is we're gonna set an annual number, and that number is gonna be set in what we call the presidential determination. And that's gonna kind of set a mark of who's gonna come, how many people are gonna arrive, and it has to be flexible because we see on a global level that there are times of crisis where we need to admit more people. I would say that we are in one of those crises right now. But we have seen that, there's an ebb and flow to how many arrivals we need to welcome. And the US can't do everything, but we certainly can play a proactive role. And so it really built in that flexibility, and it gave it over in what we call the presidential determination. I think the other thing that's really important here, and I'm going to let Lisa talk a little bit more about why CSS, but why CSS? Because this bill recognized the private-public partnership that had been existing for years in all those patchwork of resettlement. Who were the very first people to welcome refugees? Faith-based communities. That's who it was. And RAIS, which is one of the voluntary agencies, that's the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. They were the very first in 1948 welcoming people ashore and helping them navigate new systems. Lutheran Immigrant Relief Services were doing the same. USCCB, who we serve with, was doing the exact same. Faith-based communities for a very long time have been rooted in this work. It's part of their mission. And the act really recognized that. It said, like, we recognize that that maybe the federal government isn't the only piece of success in this program. And if we really want to have a successful program, we need to have what we call the private-public partnership. And many of you on this call who I recognize and know, you're part of that solution. You're the ones that come in and teach classes, distribute food, help us do the work we do, donate the beds. And that's an important part of resettlement. And it's actually a really important part of this act. And so I think Congress really acknowledged the work that had already been done. One of the things I really love about this was this act was passed unanimously in the Senate. No nay votes at all. And so the work that we do, it shouldn't be political. I mean, this is about humans and helping people in need, and Lisa said that in the very beginning, and I think the Senate recognized that when we passed this act in 1980. I can't think of very many things in recent history where I've seen things passed unanimously, but this really did. And so I just want to share just a few more brief things. I want to make sure we leave lots of time for questions, but this is one of my favorite graphs of all time. The real history geek in me is going to come out, but I'd be happy to share. You can get this data from RAPS, it's called. They update all the time where refugees are arriving from, to what states. If you're ever interested in who's coming to Alaska, I'll put it in the chat box where Lisa's talking so you all have it. But this shows refugee arrivals through the history of the program, really since the Indochina Act of 1975. And you can see where people are arriving from. So you can see, in the very first years of the program, over 200,000 people arrived to the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program in the very first year of the program. And you can see overwhelmingly the majority of people were from East Asia, right? But then it's interesting because as you go, you can see different groups or populations being resettled. So here we are in, the late 1980s, early 1990s. Largest arrival group, former Soviet Union arrivals. So you can really kind of see the history of the globe play out in who we are welcoming across the program. But what I also think we really see in this is you're looking at a unanimous decision by the Senate to welcome refugee arrivals. You're looking across a 40-year history of different administrations, different congressional outcomes, different leaders, different state departments, different, like all the different things that happen and change in our democracy all the time. And yet you're still seeing a very consistent message of high arrivals, welcome from the United States across all different variables. And I think that that's an important message, because I started by saying, why did I want to talk about this topic? Because suddenly it's become political. And I think for a really long time it wasn't. Like, I think it was just the right thing to do, and everyone knew that. And we can see the lowest arrival numbers are when? In 2002 and 2003. Why? We all know what happened on September 11th, right? And there was a lot of changes to the Refugee Resettlement Program to ensure the safety and security of all Americans. But even then, we still welcomed more people in those years than we have in the last fiscal year. The last fiscal year, the lowest refugee resettlement in history. And we are, certainly this year it will be, partly due to the pandemic, but I will also say it was the lowest presidential determination in history. So the president this year marked the determination at 18,000 arrivals, and the historic average has been 85,000. So we can see some really big changes to the program. And this is just, if anyone ever wants to not get coffee with me because we can't now, but talk to me on Zoom about the historical context of 40 years of resettlement, like I would love to talk to you about that. So like one of my favorite things is to look at this graph here. And so I just want to talk really briefly about resettlement in Alaska. Some people put in questions about demographics, so I want to be able to provide that to you. So in the late 1990s, what actually happened is secondary arrivals started moving to Delta Junction. So Alaska wasn't resettling people, but Alaska's a great place to live. Like I'm not from Alaska, you know, I wasn't born and raised here, but I came here and then for some reason it fills your soul and then you never leave. I think it just kind of happens to people. And the same thing happened. Alaska's a place for opportunity. People recognize that. And a number of former Soviet Union arrivals started to move to Delta Junction. Of all places, Delta Junction. And we still see that as a resettlement community today. So a number of arrivals started arriving in Delta Junction and people were like, how do we serve them? And so the Office of Refugee Resettlement really started to say, okay, it appears refugees are arriving to Alaska. We need to build out some programming there. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement kind of came in, met with a number of people, including the governor at the time, Tony Knowles, and CSS and others that were working in immigration work. And really what was decided by the state of Alaska at that time is we're not really the right providers for it. Again, it's a private-public partnership. It's a small population. CSS had a long history of immigration services, experience working with this population. And in 2003, we became what we call a Wilson Fish state at that time. And we took on the role as state refugee coordinator. So I started by saying, my job is program director and state refugee coordinator. That's a title that's given to one person in each state, and it's an obligation of any state that receives the Office of Refugee Resettlement Funds. So here in the state of Alaska, I have that role, and CSS acts in that role as part of this agreement with ORR. And then in 2006, we received our very first R&P case, and I'll explain what R&P means because I love to talk in acronyms. R&P is reception and placement, and so this is the new arrival program. This means, you know, a very new arrival who is destined to come to Anchorage. We were approved to be a resettlement site in 2005, and then we actually received our first case in 2006. And so that really is the start of brand new arrivals resettling to the state of Alaska, and we have been an R&P site since 2006. And historically, we would welcome around 130 people a year. 130 to 150 was the norm for Alaska. Okay, just a few last things so people can see. These are our current demographics. I just pulled these this morning, so they're the most up-to-date information I would have. So you can see by location, we serve the entire state, which is a real challenge sometimes to us. Staff are busy making sure that no matter where you live in the state, you get good services. And if anything, the pandemic has better prepared us to do this well into the future. And so I'm looking at the optimistic side of all of us being isolated. You can see over half of the caseload, close to 60% of the caseload lives in Anchorage, but we have a huge population of the caseload that lives outside of Anchorage in Wasilla, Delta Junction, Fairbanks, and then a few other remote places in the community. I just talked to our program manager today. We just enrolled someone in Juneau this morning. So that happens. And so we'll work with that person remotely and make sure they get the services that they deserve. And then by status, it's good to just kind of see who we serve. The bulk of the caseload is refugee arrivals, but we also have a large number of asylee clients, you can see there. We have a few Cuban Haitian entrants, they're called, which is another ORR population. We serve victims of trafficking, foreign-born victims of human trafficking in our program. And then the last group we call secondaries, and I'll just explain what that is. A secondary is someone who didn't initially resettle to the state of Alaska. Maybe they were resettled to Idaho or Michigan or Ohio or Texas, and then for some reason they decided to move up here to Alaska. And when that happens, they're welcome to come into our office and enroll in services too. So we have a number of secondary arrivals, and Alaska is a high secondary arrival state. We receive a number of secondaries. I think it's because we have good paying jobs. You can make a good living here, even if you don't have a formal education. And so a number of arrivals do move to the state of Alaska. And then the very last thing here, just by age category, I think people are usually interested in that. So we serve a relatively small caseload of people that are 65 and over, 0 to 18 years old. There's a lot of kids, 167 youth. And then 246 people are really what we call like the work eligible age. It doesn't mean all of those people are employable, but that's kind of that age range. We do win in the 65 plus category because we have an arrival who's 103. So she counts as like 4 people as far as I'm concerned. She's the real hero of Alaska, in my opinion. And then country of origin, this is so fascinating. We hear a lot about Anchorage has over 100 languages spoken in it. Well, I like to believe that the Refugee Resettlement Program is doing our part to ensure that Anchorage gets to keep that title. Because you can see that of the country of origin, I can tell you the biggest populations, but really what to me is fascinating is that 126 people that we currently serve come from what we call other countries. Because we serve one person from this country, one person from this country, 2 people from here. 26 different countries are currently represented in the caseload of RAIS. And so we do have big groups. We have new arrival groups that may take up the bulk of the caseload, but really we have to be experts on serving lots of different people and lots of different languages. That's a bit of a challenge. But I'll show you, this is my other countries list because I think it's important to see that it's not just maybe that dominant population you're seeing of 100 people. It's really all of these different countries represented in, and you may be the only person receiving services in the state of Alaska from your group. And I was pulling these numbers today. There were at least like 7 or 8 countries where it was just one. And I think that really does talk a lot about what RAIS does and has been doing. Is in some other states you'll see it's like this is the dominant population. Some states, like if you're in Minnesota, Somalis, there's a lot of Somali people that live in Minnesota. If you're in Ohio, those are very prominent resettlement sites for Burmese clients, for example. And really here in Alaska, just like I think all of Alaska is represented, it's a little bit of everyone, right? And so that's really it for me, but I want to finish by going back to telling you what I think really best tells the narrative of the state of Alaska and resettlement in a nutshell, which is that I told you that the very first RNP case arrived in 2006 to the state of Alaska. And that very first RNP arrival was resettled by us, given services by us. And I will tell you that that very first RNP arrival case just celebrated this year 10 years of being a staff member in the Refugee Resettlement Program. So to me, that best tells the narrative of who RAIS is, what we do, and it also really tells the narrative of resettlement, which is that most of the individuals working across the country in resettlement are refugees and immigrants themselves that are dedicated to the work that we do because they themselves came through this program and understand the importance of it and the role of it in welcoming newcomers and ensuring that they have the services and the dignity and the respect that they need to be successful here. And so for us, that's like a little like celebration we always have, that our very first free case, you know, ultimately became a staff member and now, you know, celebrated 10 years with us. And so I think that's the best way to explain what we do, is through that story right there. So that's it for me. No more slides. I know, you know, no one loves to stare at slides. So I'll turn it off. I'll turn it over to Lisa, and then we'll leave lots of time for questions at the end for either what I talked about or what Lisa shares. So thanks.
Great. Oh, thank you, Issa. It's so interesting. I love those slides. When she sent them to me, like I kind of just poured over them even before. So I just wanted to say just briefly a little about like why refugee resettlement? Why is Catholic Social Services, why is that a critical part of the services we provide? You know, I mean, I talked at the beginning about what our mission is, and I think that clearly refugee resettlement sits within our mission, but why do it? And I think that for us, I mean, first of all, it comes from faith, right? So the services here at Catholic Social Services really they're inspired by the Catholic social teachings. And that mission really compels us to address suffering and vulnerable people, and there's 80 million people in the world who are refugees or fleeing war and persecution. And that is an overwhelming, huge problem. And that is something that we cannot ignore as an agency. You know, some of you probably know Father Scott. He's now the pastor over at St. Elizabeth's. He was at St. Pat's for a long time, but he's on our board. And when he talks about it, he says, well, of course, refugee resettlement is key to what we do. Like, these are the world's homeless. How can we be a homeless provider and not have this? This is what we need to do. You know, because when we think about it, these are individuals who, because of their trauma and their experience, they're some of the most vulnerable people. And that's our mission, to serve vulnerable people. But also, it's about creating hope, right? We need to be a part of welcoming and creating hope, welcoming the stranger, welcoming people to this community and saying, all people deserve a safe place to live. All people deserve dignity and respect, and we need to be a part of that solution. So we just play a very tiny, tiny role in the huge problem of refugees or of displacement on this earth, and trying to be a part of that solution. We're just such a small part, but every part matters, and we must do our part. But I also just want to say, like, that's the motivation, but refugee resettlement and the RAIS program, they really make our agency so much stronger and better. Like, having those services and having the individuals from that program who have deep expertise in a wide range of things, that helps our whole agency. Just like I know that it helps the whole community, our agency is stronger and better because there's great expertise in employment and in diversity, in languages, and in community building. You know, our refugee program has such a strong footprint in this community around really community development and supporting supporting small groups and communities to grow and to form their own ties and connections. And that is part of the impact that we want to make on this community. That's a part of our work at Catholic Social Services. So we're so much better for having RAIS with us. All of the programs we do are stronger because of RAIS, and I think that's true for RAIS too. And so it's only together that we can really we just can do so much more. You know, I just want to. What I wrote was even better. I just started talking, but I just want to say that because the commitment of RAIS to this, because they really have a client-centered approach, and I think that we as an agency have stepped more and more into that because of the experience that RAIS has had and the success that RAIS has in the connections with their clients, and really building self-sufficiency. And you know, that's a part of what RAIS is so committed to, and that's a part of the work that we're trying to build too, because self-sufficiency is a key part of it, is just knowing how important you are. Every person is so important. And because you're important, you should take care of yourself because you matter. And that's about what self-sufficiency is. And RAIS really does so much of that great work in the community. So, I mean, I hope that really explains why it's so important to us as an agency. And I think that there's so many people on this call who see and know how important refugee resettlement and the RAIS program is to our community here in Anchorage. So I'm excited about the future. You know, I mean, in some ways, listening to this presentation and seeing the graph go down, you might think, well, you know, we might be at a low time. But, you know, I think Issa is such an optimist, and she's right. There's so much hope here. And we need to work hard because there's so many people on this planet that need the connection. But I have hope that we can do it. I know that we can do it together. And I know that from the people that I've met, that they're going to get it done if we just give them a chance. So I welcome questions. I know I had one question that I'm going to speak to, and I can right now. It's a question about donations, so I'll just we got a question, a good question about donations. It's really good. And the question was just about if people make donations to us at CSS, you know, where does it go? Do you know, like, do you know which programs or which services it goes to? And do you have a say in that? Can you find out where it is? And I just, you know, so I wanted to really respond to that and make sure everybody knows CSS is really committed to integrity and to having the highest quality programming. And a part of that is in terms of our donations. So when individuals or organizations make donations to us, if they make a donation to a specific program, then the donation goes to that program. And when you make a donation, you can choose. So if you make it online, there's a drop-down menu. If you write a check, you can just write it on the check, put a note in it. And every format that we give you to donate, you have an opportunity to say, I want it to go to this program, or I want it to go to greatest need. And that kind of goes to CSS in general. And then we as an agency put it towards where the greatest need is at that time or in that year. So I hope that that kind of speaks to it. But if anyone has any other questions or specific questions about that, I would just please reach out and give us a call. You can talk to me or to Tricia Teasley and folks on our development and communications team. We are really proud to be a 4-star rated charity on Charity Navigator and a gold level charity on GuideStar. So as you can see, those are just a bunch of kind of levels, but I think it speaks to the care that we take with our donors. We always want to make sure that we have the highest integrity. Any other questions though? We'd love to have a conversation.
Okay.
Oh, lots of questions. Good.
So I think Molly's going to field the questions for us to make it a little easier so it's structured. So
yeah. So we have a question from Kathy, which is how can we best help the RAIS program during this time of COVID-19?
Oh man, I love that question. That's a great question, Kathy. There's a couple things you can do. So Lisa talked a little bit about donor funds. And so, you know, we are lucky, and I really mean that. I cannot praise the Office of Refugee Resettlement enough. I cannot praise our partners at USCCB enough. They really provided us additional funding because of the COVID-19 crisis. And that was really important. And really when they released that funding to us, it's allowed us to provide up-to-date health information in a number of languages, ensuring clients know how to get tested, where to get tested, how to prevent COVID. It also opened up some pools of money and ways for us to better serve clients, say with their rent and utilities. And then I'll say all that and also say it's never enough, right? The need is always greater than you have. So 2 really great ways to support RAIS is this. We have 2 really important donor designated funds in RAIS. One of them is a special fund right now in honor of World Refugee Day, and the other one is a fund that always exists. And one of those funds is called the Welcome Fund. And what the Welcome Fund is it's donor designated funds that never goes anywhere except to directly benefit a client. And so I can tell you that no refugee has arrived to the state of Alaska in a number of years without receiving a brand new bed. And I'll tell you where those brand new beds came from, the Welcome Fund. Donors really providing us the funds to be able to ensure that every person who comes gets a new bed upon arrival. We use it to help people pay their rents when they're in desperate situations and don't have other responsibility, other ways to get resources. I can tell you that unfortunately an arrival that we resettled with some serious medical conditions passed away recently and the family couldn't afford the funeral costs. We provided them some assistance to cover their funeral costs out of that Welcome Fund. And so really it's a fund for us that we use at our discretion to ensure that clients receive, you know, services that make them have quality life upon arrival. And so that's a great way to help RAIS. And that fund has really helped us through COVID-19. So when you make a donation, just like Lisa said, you can select RAIS from the drop-down list and you can just write right in the special instructions Welcome Fund, and you can ensure your dollar goes directly to a refugee family. Another fund that we have open right now, which is a special fund, is called Grow Local, Give Local. And I highly encourage people to support this. With COVID-19, we saw a lot of job loss across the state, and it's no different in every community, unfortunately. And so a number of our refugee clients farm in the summer. We have a couple of really successful farm programs. And so the Grow Local, Give Local campaign, which you can find on our website in the drop-down menu, is a donation directly to that fund, which will then be used by St. Francis Food Pantry to purchase fresh produce from refugee farmers, which then will turn around and go into the hands of hungry Alaskans coming to the food pantry. So it's really a win-win overall for everybody. And so I really support, like in honor of World Refugee Day, I highly encourage you to go make a donation to Grow Local, Give Local, help refugee farmers, feed hungry Alaskans. We all win in that.
Great. We have a question from Carol. And Carol said, New York Times opinion piece from June 22nd. The Supreme Court decision last week protecting the DACA program was reason for celebration, but the Trump administration's assault on immigration isn't over. Quote, how can we best share knowledge about the importance of the CSS and RAIS program?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you heard me say, like, I recognize that these have been some really challenging years for RAIS. Like, there's no mystery to that. And I heard Lisa say CSS greatest need. And I can tell you that there have been times in recent years where RAIS was the greatest need of the program. You know, like a drop in arrivals impacted the work we were doing. And so, yeah, what can we do? I'll say this. I'll say we have a very supportive senator in Senator Lisa Murkowski who is supportive of the program. And if you went to our World Refugee Day website, you would have seen that she submitted a video in support of us and really has been, you know, very supportive of the program long term. And there's also located on the CSS website for World Refugee Day are 2 advocacy letters that you can download, one for Lisa Murkowski and one to Senator Sullivan. So I encourage you, if you're really interested, download those, send them into our senators. I mean, really the legislative arm of resettlement really is keeping the program alive, and I mean that. And I'll tell you why. While the numbers have dropped, and that really is of concern to me because every number that doesn't enter the US is a person suffering overseas. And the situation in refugee camps and refugee situations are not ones that are safe, I mean, to say the least. And so we want arrivals to arrive, but more than that, I can tell you what really all of us who work in resettlement are talking about. We want the system that is set up to receive them to survive. And that is really, really important. Because when we lose reception and placement sites around the country, if we get a new administration and they suddenly want to resettle 150,000 people, I'm going to tell you we won't be ready to do it. And so Alaskans and people that have contributed to our program are the reason RAIS is still here. And the legislative arm that supports and funds the Office of Refugee Resettlement has ensured that programs across the country have received funds to continue to serve the individuals already here. And so I think that really, if I was gonna, I'll just tell you to vote. I won't tell you how to vote, but I highly encourage you to vote as a citizen. Just like I tell my refugees when they become US citizens, today's the most important day of your life, you get to vote. I think that really is of importance in this current time, is talking to our representatives in Congress about continuing to financially support the system that is set up to support refugees living here. And I'll let Lisa chime in too.
And yeah, I'll just add that was wonderful and that's great and you should do all those things. And I'll just say, because, so many, just like Issa, when she was describing the program, she talked about how so many of these things have become so political and so politically charged now, but that isn't historically what they were or how they've been. But I just want to paraphrase on the last call the Archbishop was on and a wonderful deacon from Juneau, and they were talking about sort of why as Catholics, we're motivated to do this. And something, just to paraphrase him, he made it very clear that our role is to speak for humans when they are in need, according to our principles and to the scriptures. So I think that, with love and always with respect, to share why these people matter, why the system matters. I think that is something that we can all do and we can all speak to, and not bringing political motivation, but really political motivation only in terms of keeping that system and supporting our legislators in doing that, but not with any intent of red or blue or black or white or right or left, but really just because of the people that we know and the people on this earth who are suffering.
Thanks. The next question is, of the families in working age group, what % are employed currently? Or which, or at least one member of the family is employed? That kind of plays into another question we received about if people are able to find jobs, refugees are able to find jobs, and if so, what kind of work are they finding?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I'll tell you, I can't give you statistics by at least one member of the family. We don't poll those statistics. We look at every employable adult. And so even in a household, we may look at who's off of, we do a measure of who's off of public assistance, which would measure if like maybe one member of the household made enough income to get off of public assistance. But I'll talk a little bit to currently employed. So I would tell you that last year when I submitted our final information in FY19 employment numbers to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, that 88% of all refugees that were employable were employed in the state of Alaska. That the average starting wage was $11.88 an hour for people that were employed, and over 60, I think it was about 65% received health benefits in the job that they were employed in. And so those are just some basic demographics at the close of last fiscal year. Now let me tell you about what I know now post-COVID. The low, when I pulled the statistics for overall employment, employable adults that were actively employed, I pulled them in April, we were down to 61% of people that were employable were employed. And so COVID had serious implications for refugee families. A number who work in jobs like housekeeping or restaurant work or other things, they really were impacted by what happened. And so that was a real challenge. Luckily, case management and others really helped families navigate that through unemployment insurance or the pandemic unemployment insurance and other programs that were available to them. But we're slowly seeing that number move up. We're really seeing in the last 6 months pre-COVID, so like I can give you a bunch of different statistics and they're all going to be different, right? In the 6-month report I just turned in for the first half of this year, which would have gone from October 1st to March 30th, March 31st, actually average starting hourly wages for full-time jobs for refugees was over $14 an hour. So refugees that come here do very, very well and fare very well. A lot of that, of course, is dependent on the economy. So I wouldn't really want to say that the current percentage, I want to answer the question honestly, because it says currently. I don't think that's a real demonstration of success of refugees in Alaska in employment. I think it's a very challenging time, and certainly that's having impacts on the program right now and on those families. But pre that, we were really seeing an uptick in really good paying jobs. And we were resettling a large number of individuals from the former Soviet Union that come with contracting skills or construction skills, and they're getting very good jobs. And RAIS is helping them do that. So if anyone's really interested in employment numbers after this and you really want like really good statistics, I would love to send them to you. We collect them and report them to the Office of Refugee Resettlement on a 6-month basis and yearly for an annual report.
And I'll just say, just because of COVID, you know, you've probably seen reports nationally about how many immigrants and refugees and asylees are working in essential worker positions. And that's true up here as well, and really important. And there's an amazing story on the website of one of our refugee clients who's an essential worker, and it's really moving. She works at Regional Hospital. But just to keep in mind, a lot of, I think as we all know, a lot of those kind of essential but, you know, hard frontline work, those are a lot of times the positions that our refugee clients are taking. And so they've been working, some of them have really been working hard throughout this in really tough times. Great,
thanks. I think maybe we'll have one more or two more questions time for, but the next question is, what are the most pressing needs of refugees in Anchorage, and how can we best address them in our community?
Yeah, it's always hard for me to answer what the most pressing need is. And I'll tell you why, because and I think Lisa kind of said this, like every refugee is a different individual, a different family, a different, you know, like And RAIS really centers itself and prides itself on approaching each case with the unique skills, abilities, and resilience that that family brings to us. And so we work really hard to do what we call a quality of life scale with every family, where we look at how are they faring in medical, how are they faring in their children's schooling, how are they faring in accessing services, what are their language capacities, and then really working with them to create what we call a family self-sufficiency plan. So what do we need to provide to them to help them get to where they want to go? And that, instead of us saying, this is the pathway forward, it's us sitting down together and saying, how can we make a pathway forward? And what do you need from us? And how can I help you navigate it? I'm amazed by the resilience of refugees. Like, they know what they need. They just don't understand the system. And we're really system navigators more than anything else. And so when I think about the pressing need, it's hard, because I would say almost in every situation, there's a different pressing need in a person's experience. But I'll say some of the pressing needs that I think we've looked at and tried to work towards, is one of them is mental health. Like, I think there's a need in Alaska for more quality mental health services, and more accessibility for individuals, say on Medicaid or other programs, to access mental health services. That's a pressing need in our state, and it's one that impacted our refugee arrivals. And we received some funding with Alaska Community Foundation, and Dr. Buckingham's on this call. She's a partner over at the University of Alaska Anchorage, which we couldn't do this project without. And we've really focused on training mental health providers through a project we called Working Alongside Refugees in Mental Health. That was a real pressing need that we're working towards trying to, resolve. Another pressing need is the distance. The distance of the state of Alaska is great. And I showed you where my clients live, and they live all over the state. And that's a real pressing need for us to make sure that we didn't build a resettlement program that was just for Anchorage. And in many ways, we built a resettlement program for Anchorage because for a number of years, 90% of the caseload, 95% of the caseload lived in Anchorage. And that's not what we look like anymore. Now we have a caseload that lives in Delta Junction in Wasilla. And so I think another pressing need from the perspective of CSS is to get out into the Mat-Su Borough, get to know those, the members of the government there, to expand our employer workforce there. And so I think that's a pressing need, and I'm talking a lot about our pressing needs. And so I'll just say, the last real pressing need that we need volunteer support in is just as COVID happens and as we all have been distancing, one of the greatest prides of our program really is that agricultural program. But as markets are slowing, and the worst thing that can happen is farm produce goes to waste. So I really would say, in a pressing current need, get down to the farm stand every day, 4 to 7 p.m. through 3601 Mountain View Drive, and buy some fresh kale, buy some fresh radishes, meet a refugee that lives in your community. You could listen to Lisa and I talk for hours about refugees, and I really could talk for hours about refugees. I won't put you through that. Or you could just go to the farm stand and meet them yourself. And that is how you become a community. That's how you become a member of understanding what resettlement's all about. And it's the best way really to support people right now, many who have lost their jobs and are relying on that agricultural money to get them through the next few months until the economy starts to stabilize and they have access to work. And so that's a very broad answer, but I really think, that's something you can do today. And I just hesitate to ever talk without saying the work we do in pressing needs without partners like Sarah, Dr. Buckingham over at UAA, or our partners at ACLT that help us run the farm. We don't do that without them. And so it really is a community effort.
Wonderful. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat bar, but if you have anything else, you're welcome to send it in. Otherwise, I'll send it back to Issa to wrap things up.
And I'll promptly send it right back to Lisa because I talked way too much and people hear me too often. So I'll promptly send it back to Lisa to close us out. But before we do, I'll just say, there is the grand opening of the farm stand, which you've heard me say. I think Molly can maybe put in the address in the chat box for us. I'll be out there tomorrow, basically from noon to 7. So if you attended a Zoom conversation, you see me, I'll be wearing a mask. I hope you will be too. Come over and say hi. We'll stand 6 feet apart, but then we can at least look at each other and we can talk a little bit more. I'm always happy to chat with people out in the community, or my email, which is found on the website at any time.
and I'll just say, I wrote in the chat, but I know there's some of our longtime RAIS volunteers on this call, and hello to you. And if you're trying to stay socially distant, but you want to buy some produce, you just reach out to me and I'll deliver it to you, okay? So you just let me know. I love driving around town. It gives me a chance to get out of my office, which is great. I just want to, I'll just end by saying thank you. I mean, this is the last of our Zoom meetings of this forum, which I think was really successful in celebration of World Refugee Day and World Refugee Week. And that celebration, for folks who have been to it before, you know, historically it's always a big party, and we're all together, and there's music and dancing and food, and it feels like such a celebration. And I have to say that looking as in the week before World Refugee Day, I was worried. I was a little sad, because it's a really special celebration, and I know many people on this call attend, and we're grateful that you do, and so many of our clients attend, and their families and their friends. So I was worried, but I have to say that these calls have been wonderful. You know, we're so appreciative that so many in the community called in, participated, shared their questions and their discussion and their comments with us about this. And, you know, even though I hope that next year this isn't how we celebrate World Refugee Day, I hope that we're at a place that we can all come together and celebrate. I also hope that these kinds of conversations can continue, because this is also about community building. And so much of what refugee resettlement is about community building. It's about supporting individuals, and it's about supporting communities. So we're just really proud to be here and to be able to talk about this. Issa is an extraordinary leader, and her team is amazing, and they do extraordinary work in this community. I'm really proud to work with them, and I thank them for all the work that they do, and I thank all the volunteers on this call, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. I'll leave it on for just a couple more minutes in case we didn't get to a question. Now you're thinking of one, but I'll turn the recording off now. Thanks.